The cork smelled of yew. It was 2 in the morning, and the Duchess crossed the courtyard alone. From the nursery window of Welbourn Hall, Jacintha Bourchier lowered the boy's stocking and watched the ash-blonde figure slip into the medicinal greenhouse. A governess of 23, in a dead-leaf brown gown and pale gray apron, she had learned to notice what others were too proud to see. The Duchess carried no lantern. She did not need one. She knew the path between the yew hedges by heart. By morning, the Duke of Welbourn sat at his breakfast table and could not lift the silver spoon to his mouth. Orlando Mowbray, master of the largest estate in Derbyshire, a man with a sabre scar from Talavera and steel-gray eyes that frightened ministers, gripped the edge of the cloth as the room tilted. Lady Drusilla, his second wife, laid a porcelain hand on his sleeve and suggested, sweetly, that Dr. Kane increase the dose. Kane, a red-haired man whose eyes never met another's for long, agreed. That night, by candlelight, Jacintha and the old housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, emptied the cobalt-blue vial. They replaced its contents with chamomile water. The poison itself they sealed into an identical bottle, marked with a small wax cross, and hid it beneath the floorboards of the nursery. 3 days later, the Duke walked unaided into the library. He stopped Jacintha in the corridor and, for the first time since his first wife's grave, began to speak of his son. But behind a volume of heraldry, Jacintha had already found something far worse. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The autumn of 1817 had stripped the oaks of Derbyshire bare, and the wind that crossed the park of Welbourn Hall carried the first true cold of the season under the slate roofs of the great house. In the nursery on the second floor, a single tallow candle burned beside a small mended work-basket, and Jacintha Bourchier sat upright on a low stool, threading her needle through the worn heel of a little boy's wool stocking. The clock on the mantel struck 2. She did not raise her head. She had taught herself, in 2 years under this roof, not to raise her head at sounds in the night. The boy slept 3 doors down the corridor. His door left ajar as she always left it, and her ear was tuned to him alone. The candle guttered. She trimmed the wick with her steel scissors, set them down with a small precise click, and resumed her work. The stocking was the 3rd she had mended that night. Lord Cassian wore through his heels faster than the laundress could keep pace. What she minded was the smell. It had come down the back stairs an hour before, faint at first, mistaken for the kitchen herbs, a green, resinous bitterness, like a pine bough crushed in a damp glove. Twice she had set her work aside and gone to the door, and twice she had come back to the stool. The smell did not belong in a great house at 2 in the morning. It belonged in a still room, in a glass alembic, in the patient hands of someone who knew what she was about. She rose now without sound and crossed to the nursery window. The casement looked down over the kitchen courtyard, and, beyond the low wall, the dark, glittering rectangle of the medicinal glass house that the late Duchess had loved. A lantern was moving across the cobbles. The light was held low, as a person holds a light who does not wish to be seen from the upper windows. Jacintha pressed her shoulder to the wall and watched without breathing. The figure stopped at the glass-house door. A gloved hand lifted to the lock. The lantern swung once, the light catching the edge of an ivory silk shawl and a single white ostrich feather, and then the door opened and closed, and the courtyard was dark again. Drusilla, Duchess of Welbourn, did not garden. Jacintha knew this in the way governesses know things they have not been told. The Duchess did not ride, did not visit the tenants, did not speak to the boy, except to comment on the cut of his jacket. She had buried a husband at 25, and married a duke at 27. Jacintha let the curtain fall. She returned to her stool. She picked up the stocking. She set 3 more stitches, and on the 4th her hand slowed and stopped. The smell was stronger now, drifting in along the floorboards from the back stairs. Pine bough, damp glove. Underneath, faintly metallic, like an old penny under the tongue. She knew that smell. Her father had been a country apothecary in Hampshire, and as a child she had sat on a stool in his shop and learned the jars by their colors. The cobalt jars held the dangers: foxglove, hemlock, and 1 slim phial on a high shelf behind a brass key, the resin of the English yew. Taxus baccata. He had let her smell it once, holding the stopper a careful inch beneath her nose. Jacintha set the stocking down on her knee. She did not move for the space of 3 breaths. She was a sensible woman, and a sensible woman does not run from a smell. A smell could be 10 things. A smell could be the under-housemaid burning a posy of greens for a toothache. A smell could be the new gardener boiling something for the orchids. A smell could be many things in a house. None of them, at 2 in the morning, in a private glass house, under a hidden lantern. She rose, lifted the candle, and went out into the corridor. The nursery door she closed softly behind her, on its felted hinge. She crossed to Lord Cassian's door and stood a moment in the gap, listening to the small, even breath of a sleeping child. The boy lay on his side, sandy curls flattened against the bolster, 2 front teeth missing from a small open mouth. He had asked her, that afternoon, whether his father had been ill long. She had said only that his father was strong. She closed his door also and went down the back stairs. The servants' passage at the foot of the stairs was empty. The smell was stronger here, and now mixed with something else, the sweet vegetable damp of crushed leaves. From the still room at the end of the passage came a thin line of yellow light under the door. Jacintha did not approach it. She turned instead through the boot room, into the scullery, and out by the small side door that gave onto the kitchen courtyard. The cold struck her face. She set the candle down on the stone step inside the door and pinched the wick. The courtyard had no moon. The glass house was a low constellation of glass panes against the stable wall, and through the panes she could see, dimly, the warm shape of the lantern set down on a workbench. She crossed the cobbles on the balls of her feet. The door of the glass house stood not quite closed. A breath of warm air came through the gap, herbal and rich, and within it the green resin smell undisguised. Jacintha did not push the door. She stood beside the hinge, in the shadow of the brick lean-to, and looked through the crack. Drusilla stood at the workbench with her back half turned. The ostrich feather was gone. She had taken off her cap. Her ash-blonde ringlets were pinned up and she had drawn on a long apron of brown holland over her ivory gown, as a careful chemist will. On the bench before her lay a flat tin tray of dark leaves, finely shredded, and 3 glass vessels, a wide mortar still wet from washing, a small alembic, and a narrow blue cobalt phial of the kind Jacintha had not seen since her father's shop. The Duchess lifted the phial to the lantern, tilted it twice, watched the liquid run slow against the glass, and then, with a small, steady pleasure, drove a fresh cork into the neck. She set the phial down. She took the cork out again, sniffed it once, and put it into the small velvet reticule at her wrist. A cork that smelt of yew, kept on the wrist of a duchess. Jacintha understood, then, what she was looking at. She did not move. She did not breathe. She watched the Duchess wipe the bench with a clean linen cloth, fold the cloth, and tuck it into the brazier coals where it caught with a small clean flame. She watched the Duchess take the blue phial and set it inside the locked cupboard at the back of the bench. She watched the Duchess turn down the lantern, lift it, and come toward the door. Jacintha was already gone. She crossed the courtyard at a long, quiet stride, slipped through the scullery door, took up her candle, and was 3 steps up the back stair before the glasshouse door clicked shut behind the Duchess in the yard. She did not light the wick again. She went up in the dark, by counting the treads with her hand on the wall, the way she had counted the jars in her father's shop. In the nursery, she set the candle on the work-basket, sat down on the stool, and picked up the boy's stocking. She set 3 even stitches. Her hands did not tremble. This was something she noticed about herself, with a remote small interest, as if from above. Her hands were perfectly steady. It was her thinking that was running ahead of her hands, down corridors and through doors, into the room where the Duke of Wellborn had been sitting white-faced over his coffee for a fortnight, his hand on the table beside the cup that the Duchess always poured. The Duke had been ill since Michaelmas. A vertigo, the household said. Dr. Kane, the new family physician, called daily and prescribed a tonic in a small brown bottle, of which the dose was steadily increased. The Duke, who had ridden at Talavera and taken a saber cut from temple to jaw and remained in the saddle, had begun to grip the back of his chair when he stood. Lord Cassian had asked, that afternoon, whether his father had been ill long. Jacintha put down the stocking. She blew the candle out. In the dark she sat upright on the stool, her hands folded in her lap, and waited for the grey dawn. She had £2.17 in a tin under the boards beneath her bed. She had Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, who had served the late Duchess for 30 years. It would have to be Mrs. Pemberton. At first light she rose, dressed without sound in her foil mort gown and white linen cap, fastened the small black cameo mourning brooch at her throat, and went down to the housekeeper's room. Mrs. Pemberton was already there, the keyring at her waist, half-moon spectacles low on her nose, writing in the household book. The fire had been lit. There was no one else in the room. Jacintha closed the door behind her with her shoulder. Mrs. Pemberton did not look up. "You were on the back stairs at 2, the housekeeper said. "I heard your tread." "Yes." "And the side door." "Yes." Mrs. Pemberton laid down her pen and lifted her eyes. They were dark brown and quite steady, and the slight tremor of her right hand was, this morning, perfectly still. "And what did you see, Miss Bourchier?" Jacintha crossed to the table. She did not sit. She put her hand flat on the wood. "I saw a cobalt phial," she said, "filled at 2 in the morning, from shredded leaves the color of bay, stopped with a cork that smelt of yew. Locked into the bench cupboard in the medicinal glass house." Mrs. Pemberton looked at her. The half-moon spectacles slid a little down the nose. "By whose hand?" "By the Duchess." There was a silence. From the kitchen below came the clean, small sound of the scullery maid breaking the ice on the water butt. Mrs. Pemberton took off her spectacles, folded them onto the ribbon at her chest, and set both palms on the household book as if to hold it down. "His Grace," she said, "is to take a stronger dose of the tonic this morning. Dr. Kane recommended it last night, in the library, before he went home. Her Grace was present. I served the tea." Jacintha said nothing. "The cup," Mrs. Pemberton said, "is always poured by Her Grace." "Yes." "And the dose," Mrs. Pemberton said, "is kept in a small brown bottle, which Dr. Kane refills from a phial he carries in his bag, which he leaves overnight in the sideboard of the breakfast room, to which Her Grace alone has the key." Jacintha drew breath. "Then the phial in the bench cupboard," she said, "will be in Dr. Kane's bag by noon. It will. And in his small brown bottle by tea. It will." The two women looked at one another across the household book. Outside, the courtyard bell rang the half-hour. From the schoolroom above came the small, clear voice of Lord Cassian, awake early, calling for his governess. Mrs. Pemberton closed the book. "Chamomile," she said quietly, "is in the still-room cupboard. The phials are kept on the second shelf. The cobalt ones, behind the door, on the left. I have, this morning, 2 empty ones the same." Jacintha understood her. "Wax," she said. "I shall want a stick of red wax, and a clean knife. Both are in my drawer." The voice of the boy came again from upstairs, sleepy and certain, calling her name. Jacintha turned from the table. At the door she paused with her hand on the latch. "Mrs. Pemberton?" "Yes. If we are seen at this, we shall hang." "I know it," the housekeeper said. She picked up her pen again, and dipped it, and resumed her entry in the household book in a hand entirely without tremor. Jacintha lifted the latch and went out into the corridor. She climbed the back stair at her usual measured pace, neither faster nor slower than any other morning. A maid passed her on the half-landing with a coal scuttle and bobbed a small curtsy. Jacintha returned the nod she had returned 1,000 times. In the nursery, the boy was sitting up in his shirt, fighting the buttons of his skeleton suit, with grave concentration. He looked up when she came in. "Papa is to take the strong tonic today," he said. "Cook told me. She said it would set him right." Jacintha knelt beside the small chair and took the buttons from him. "Did she?" "Yes." He held very still, the way he had been taught to hold for her. "Will it set him right?" She fastened the navy buttons one by one along the white ruffled placket. Her fingers were neat and quick. "Your father," she said, "is a soldier. He took a saber to the face at Talavera, and he sat his horse for another 6 hours. A man like that is not so easily set right or set wrong by a small brown bottle." The boy considered this. "Miss Bourchier." "Yes?" "Why does she always pour his cup?" Jacintha finished the last button. She smoothed the small cream waistcoat down over the shirt. She straightened the boy's collar with one finger. "Because she is the Duchess," she said. "Wash your face. We shall have an early lesson before breakfast. I should like you to read me the Latin you had yesterday." He slid down from the chair and went to the washstand, patting on small bare feet across the rug. Jacintha watched him a moment from the floor. Then she rose, crossed to the writing desk, and from beneath the bottom drawer she lifted out a small flat tin box. Inside the tin were her 2 pounds and 17 shillings, a pressed sprig of rosemary from her mother's grave, a letter from her cousin in Lincoln dated 3 Christmases past, and a thin stub of red sealing wax. She put the wax into her apron pocket. The morning passed at the slow tempo of all mornings at Welbourne. Lord Cassian read his Latin in a clear, careful voice, and mistook the ablative for the dative twice. At 9, he was taken down to make his bow to his father before the meal. In the corridor outside, she heard the small voice of the boy say, "Good morning, Papa," and a deeper voice, much weakened, "Take 3 breaths to finish the greeting." At 11, Jacintha went down by the back stair to the still room. Mrs. Pemberton was waiting at the cupboard. The door stood open. On the second shelf, behind the door, on the left, 2 cobalt phials stood empty beside a stoppered jar of dried chamomile flowers. Between them, on the deal counter, the housekeeper had laid out a small clean knife and a tin cup of warm water. Jacintha took the stub of red wax from her apron pocket and laid it down beside the knife. "Her Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly, "is at her toilette until noon. Dr. Kane arrives at 12. The glass house is locked, but the key hangs in the housekeeper's room, on a black ribbon, beside the linen book." Jacintha looked at her. "You have had a key cut," she said. "I have had a key cut," Mrs. Pemberton said, "the day Her Grace dismissed the second undergardener for asking what was growing in the back beds. I am 60 next spring, Miss Bourchier. I do not propose to bury another master in this house." She lifted the iron keyring from her waist, sorted along it without looking, and held out a small bright key on a black silk ribbon. Jacintha took it. She left the still room by the scullery door and crossed the courtyard in plain daylight, a housekeeper's errand in her hand, as if she had been sent for a sprig of bay. The glasshouse door opened to her key. Inside, the warm herbal air closed around her like the air of her father's shop. She went directly to the bench cupboard. The lock was small and new. The key turned. On the middle shelf, alone, stood the cobalt phial, freshly corked, the cork showing the small, clean cut of last night's knife. She lifted it out. She set it on the bench. From her apron, she took the empty phial Mrs. Pemberton had given her, and the small paper twist of chamomile water she had made up that morning over the still room fire. She filled the empty phial to the same line. She corked it with a fresh cork from the housekeeper's drawer. She set it in the cupboard on the middle shelf, alone, exactly as the other had stood. The poisoned phial she wrapped in a clean square of linen and slipped inside the deep pocket beneath her apron. She locked the cupboard. She locked the glasshouse door. She crossed the courtyard at her usual measured pace. In the still room, behind the closed door, Mrs. Pemberton was already heating the stub of red wax over a candle. Jacintha drew the linen-wrapped phial from her pocket and set it on the deal counter. The housekeeper took up the small clean knife. She turned the phial against the light. On the curved blue glass, low on the shoulder where a careless hand would not see it, she pressed the soft red wax in a small, even cross. "X, there," she said. "That is the one that kills." Jacintha looked at the small red mark on the cobalt glass and felt, for the first time that morning, her hands begin, very faintly, to tremble. She closed her fingers over the phial and put it back into her apron pocket. Above them, somewhere in the body of the great house, a clock struck the half-hour before noon. In half an hour, Dr. Kane would step down from his gig at the front door. In 2 hours, a small brown bottle on a breakfast room sideboard would be refilled from a phial that no longer contained what it had contained at dawn. At tea, in the long drawing room, the Duchess of Welborn would lift a silver pot and pour, with her own careful gloved hand, a cup of chamomile water into the cup of her husband. And somewhere in the apron of a governess, behind a small red cross of wax, the death that had been meant for him would wait, instead, for the moment it was needed. Jacintha straightened her collar. She fastened the cameo at her throat. She climbed the back stair to the schoolroom, where a 7-year-old boy was drawing a horse on the back of his page and waiting to be told whether it was a good one. Between the still room and the schoolroom, the length of a single staircase, the house had changed beneath her feet. She had until tea. The breakfast room at Welborn Hall faced east, and the autumn light came in long and pale across the polished mahogany, catching on the silver coffee service and the cut crystal of the marmalade dish. Jacintha had not been summoned, and yet she stood at the threshold with the boy's hand in her own, because Cassian had insisted, and because she had needed an excuse to be near the Duke's table without being seen to want one. Drusilla was already seated. Her ivory Gros de Naples gown caught the light like the inside of a shell. She poured chocolate for herself with a slow, steady wrist, and she did not look up. "Papa is late," Cassian whispered. "Then we shall wait quietly," Jacintha said. The grandfather clock in the corner struck the quarter hour. A footman shifted his weight by the sideboard. From the corridor came the sound of the Duke's tread, uneven, slower than yesterday, and then the door opened. Orlando Mowbray entered with one hand on the lintel. He had dressed, but the cravat had been tied by a man whose fingers no longer answered him properly. The scar across his face stood out very white against a skin gone the color of tallow. He took 3 paces into the room, and then he stopped, very still, the way a horse stops when the ground beneath it shifts. "My lord," said Drusilla. He did not answer her at once. He lifted a hand to his temple, then lowered it again with a deliberate care, as a man might handle a vessel that he suspected of being cracked. "Forgive me," he said. "A moment." He reached the chair at the head of the table and sat down. The footman moved at once to fill his cup, and Orlando shook his head, then regretted the motion and closed his eyes. Drusilla was watching him over the rim of her cup. Her mouth was soft, her eyes were not. "The vertigo again," she said. "My poor love. It will pass. It has not passed in 3 weeks. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and Jacintha, standing very still in the doorway with her hand on Cassian's shoulder, saw something flicker across the Duke's face. Not suspicion, not yet, but the dull, exhausted patience of a man who has been told for a long time that he is unwell and has begun to believe it. "Cassian," said the Duke. His voice was hoarse. "Come here." The boy went. Orlando did not lift him as he once would have done. He laid a hand on the small sandy head and held it there for a moment, and Jacintha saw the hand tremble, very faintly, before he took it away. "Be good to your governess," the Duke said. "Go and read your Latin." "Yes, Papa." Cassian came back across the carpet, and Jacintha curtsied to the table, and the curtsy held a heartbeat longer than was necessary, because she had seen the trembling of the hand, and she could not at once make her knees straighten. Drusilla noticed. "Miss Bourchier, Your Grace, the chocolate is exceptional this morning. Take a cup to the schoolroom for the child." "His Grace prefers milk, madam." "Then take milk." A small smile. "Only do not stand in doorways. It draws a draught." Jacintha withdrew. In the corridor she stopped and pressed her back against the cold paneling and breathed once, slowly, through her nose. The boy looked up at her. "Is Papa going to die?" She knelt at once, so that her face was level with his. "No," she said. "Truly?" "Truly. Now go and find Mrs. Pemberton, and ask her for warm bread, and tell her I shall be along directly." He went. She stayed kneeling on the flagstones a moment longer than was wise, because her hands had begun to shake, and she did not wish a footman to see it. Behind her, in the breakfast room, she heard the soft chime of porcelain set down on porcelain, and Drusilla's voice, perfectly pitched, saying that the chocolate had gone cold, that someone really ought to ring for fresh. The voice was that of a woman with nowhere in particular to be, and nothing in the world to fear. Jacintha rose, she smoothed the front of her feuille-morte gown. She walked the length of the gallery without looking at the portraits of dead Mowbrays who watched her pass. At the foot of the back stair she met a footman carrying away the breakfast service. On the tray, half hidden by a folded napkin, stood a small glass cruet of what looked like clarified honey, and beside it a silver spoon still wet from the Duke's cup. The footman did not see her notice. He bowed and went on. She climbed. Dr. Kane was sent for at noon. He came in his tobacco-brown coat with the bag of bleeders, and he was shown into the Duke's study, and he was there for the better part of an hour. Jacintha, passing on the gallery above with a basket of mended linen, heard his voice pitched low and confidential, and Drusilla's voice answering, and once she heard the word strengthen, she paused on the landing. Below, through the half-open door, Drusilla was speaking. "A stronger dose, then, if the present draught no longer answers. A stronger preparation, Your Grace, is not without risk. The constitution, my husband's constitution, is robust. It is his nerves that fail him. I shall not see him suffer another week of this." "Of course not, madam." "The blue phial, doctor, twice the measure, morning and night." A pause, then Kane again, lower. "Your Grace must understand that should anything—" "I understand perfectly. You have my note already, do you not?" Silence. "Then we understand one another. Send up the new draft before tea." Jacintha did not move on the landing. She held the basket of linen against her ribs, and she did not breathe until the study door opened below, and Kane came out into the hall, settling his cravat, and crossed to the front door without looking up. A maid passed her on the back stair with an armful of folded sheets and said good day, and Jacinta returned the greeting in a voice she did not recognize as her own. At the turning she paused, set her hand against the cold plaster, and waited until her pulse had slowed before she went on. She went on then, very quickly, to the still room. Mrs. Pemberton was at the long deal table, weighing tallow on the brass scales. She did not look up when the door opened, but she said, "Shut it." Jacinta shut it. She put the basket of linen on the dresser. She said, "He has ordered Cain to double the dose." The old woman set down the scoop. Her hands rested on the edge of the table for a moment, and then she lifted her half-moon spectacles and folded them carefully against her chest. "When?" "Before tea. Then we have until 4 o'clock. "Yes." Mrs. Pemberton turned. Her round, wrinkled face was perfectly composed, but the tremor in her right hand had grown a little worse, and Jacinta noticed it and looked away. "The blue phial," said the housekeeper, "is kept in the cabinet behind the bed curtain. She wears the key on a ribbon at her throat. She does not wear it when she bathes. She bathes at 3. "Yes." The two women looked at each other across the deal table, and Mrs. Pemberton said, very quietly, "You understand, child, what you are proposing." "I understand what she is proposing. If we are wrong, we are not wrong. I smelt the U on her hand last night, and I saw Cain's face just now in the hall. He does not look at one. He has not looked at any of us in a fortnight." Mrs. Pemberton was silent. Then she crossed to the high shelf and took down a small brown jar of dried chamomile flowers, and set it on the table between them. "Chamomile water," she said, "clear, faintly yellow, indistinguishable in a blue phial from what is presently in it. We shall need a second flask. There is one in the linen cupboard, the old apothecary's bottle that held the lavender essence. Cobalt blue, identical. Then fetch it and bring the sealing wax. Mrs. Pemberton, child, if she finds the substitution before nightfall, then we shall not survive the week. I am aware." The old woman did not soften her face. She only set both hands flat upon the deal table, and the tremor in the right one had quieted, as it sometimes did when the matter at hand grew grave enough to demand of her body the last of its discipline. "Go," she said. Jacinta went. At 3 o'clock, the bell rang for the Duchess's bath. Maids carried up the copper cans, and the door of the great chamber closed behind them, and Drusilla's voice, light and pleasant, gave instructions about the temperature of the water. Jacinta was in the linen passage with Mrs. Pemberton. She had the kettle of chamomile water under her shawl, and the empty cobalt phial in her apron pocket, and a small ivory-handled penknife in her sleeve for the seal. "The dressing-room door," whispered the housekeeper, "is on the latch. She forgets it when the maids are with her in the bath. You will have 4 minutes, no more. 4 is enough. If she comes through, drop the phial and say you were dusting. Yes. Go." Jacinta went along the passage on her felt slippers, and the dressing-room door gave inward at a touch, and she stepped inside and closed it behind her. The room smelt of orris root and of the warm damp from the bath beyond the inner door. Behind the curtained bedstead the small walnut cabinet stood, its key still in the lock, because Drusilla had been careless, or because she had been certain that no one in this house would dare. Jacinta turned the key. The door opened on a smell of something faintly bitter, like crushed almond husks and old hay, and she did not let herself smell it long. The blue phial stood on the second shelf. It was the size of her thumb. The cork was sealed with red wax, and a single letter had been pressed into the wax, a small, ornate S. Scrope. She took it down. Her hand did not shake. She had ordered it not to. From her apron she drew the empty twin, and from the kettle beneath her shawl she poured the chamomile water until the level matched. She corked the new phial. She heated the penknife in the candle on the mantel, and pressed a clean disc of red wax over the cork, and into the soft wax she pressed, not an S, but a small careful cross, an X, because she would need to know later which was which, and she could not trust her memory to a house in which she was already a hunted thing. The true phial she slid into the inner pocket sewn at the waist of her gown, where Mrs. Pemberton had set it that morning for this purpose. The false phial she set on the second shelf, exactly where the true one had stood. She turned the key in the lock. She left the key in the lock, as Drusilla had left it. She paused. Her eye fell on a slim Morocco notebook lying beneath a folded silk scarf on the lower shelf. The corner of a sheet protruded, a half line of writing in Drusilla's small backward slanted hand, the letters too neat. the loops too patient. She did not dare take it. She memorized the cover, the gilt initial D pressed into the leather, the place of the scarf. One day, she thought, that notebook would have to come down. Not today. From the bath beyond came a small, contented sigh, and the splash of a sponge being squeezed against a porcelain shoulder. Jacintha crossed to the door, lifted the latch, slipped through, and closed it without a sound behind her. In the passage, Mrs. Pemberton was bending over a chest of pillow slips, as if she had been there for hours. She did not look up. She only said, very softly, "Go." Jacintha went. The tea tray was carried up at 4. Drusilla herself, in a fresh gown of pale rose, took the blue phial from the cabinet and measured out the doubled dose with a glass dropper into the Duke's cup. She did this in the small antechamber with the door open, so that any servant passing might see her tenderness. She carried the cup to her husband with her own hands. She set it down at his elbow on the little table by the fire. "Drink, my love." Orlando drank. He paused with the cup half lifted. He looked at it. He set it down, and then he picked it up again, and he drank, because the alternative was an argument that he did not have the strength to begin. The Duchess's hand rested lightly on his sleeve. Her thumb moved against the broadcloth, once, in a small caressing motion that no footman could have read as anything but devotion. He drank a second cup. He drank a third when she pressed it on him. He drank because he was tired, and because the woman who poured it was his wife, and because to refuse her at the hearth in the sight of the footman would have been a public unkindness for which he had neither the energy nor the grounds. Jacintha was in the schoolroom upstairs, hearing Cassian recite his Latin verbs. She heard the long case clock strike the half-hour. She heard a footman go past with the empty tray. She heard, faintly, far below, the Duke laugh at something his wife had said, and the laugh was thin, but it was a laugh, and not the gasp of a man whose pulse had begun to fail. She closed her eyes. She let out a breath she had been holding, it seemed, since dawn. The relief lasted only until she opened them again. For the substitution had bought a day, perhaps 2, it had bought no more. Drusilla would notice. The eau preparation had a faint bitter undertaste that chamomile water could not feign, and Drusilla, who had measured it herself, would in time taste it on her husband's breath when she kissed him good night, and would know. What then would follow? Jacintha could not yet see. "Miss," said Cassian, "amo, amas, amat. Am I right?" "You are right, my dove. Go on." "Amamus, amatis, amant." "Perfect." Beyond the schoolroom window, the autumn rain had begun again, and somewhere along the gravel sweep below, Dr. Kane's gig rattled off into the dusk, the doctor sitting very upright with his hat pulled low, and not once looking back at the house. In the small inner pocket at Jacintha's waist, the true phial pressed cold against her ribs, marked with its little cross of wax, waiting for the day it would be opened in a room she could not yet imagine, before men whose names she did not yet know. She set her hand against the pocket. She smoothed her apron. She bent again over the boy's slate, and she heard, without permitting herself to turn her head, the soft, slow footstep of the Duchess of Welborn, climbing the great stair toward her husband's room, humming a tune under her breath. The tune was a country air she had heard once before, on the night she had crossed the yard at 2 in the morning with a phial in her hand. Jacintha set the slate pencil down, and waited until the humming had passed by, and only then did she allow herself to look toward the door. Cassian, unaware, turned the page of his Latin primer and began the next declension in his clear, small voice, while the rain on the schoolroom window deepened into the long, steady fall that would not lift for 3 days, and the house, beneath them, held its breath. By the third morning the rain had not lifted, and the Duke of Welborn was on his feet again. He came down the great oak staircase one careful step at a time, his right hand white against the banister, his left clenched at his side as if he refused to let it tremble in company. Pendrell, the valet, hovered 2 paces behind with a folded greatcoat. Orlando waved him off. He had dressed himself. The midnight blue tailcoat sat clean on his shoulders, the cravat tied tight enough to hide the loss of weight at the throat, the signet ring back on his right pinky after 3 days on the bedside table. He intended to be seen vertical before noon. Jacintha heard his step from the gallery above and did not look down. She was carrying a stack of Cassian's copybooks toward the schoolroom, her arms full, her head tilted to keep the topmost from sliding. She had not slept more than 4 hours in any of the 3 nights past. The cobalt vial marked with its small wax cross lay sewn into the lining of her stays, against her ribs, where it warmed with her body and reminded her, each time she drew breath, of what she had done. Mrs. Pemberton had brewed the chamomile herself and decanted it into the original bottle with a steady left hand and a trembling right. 3 days. The Duke had drunk the false dose 3 times, and 3 times had not died. He had, instead, begun to recover. Drusilla noticed it before anyone else. Jacintha had watched her at breakfast on the second morning, the ivory fan moving in slow, even strokes, the ice-blue eyes resting on her husband's plate as he ate a soft-boiled egg without flinching. The fan had paused, a single beat, then resumed. Drusilla had smiled at Kane across the table and said only, "How encouraging, doctor. Perhaps the new tincture agrees with him after all." Kane had not answered. His ruddy hand had shaken on the cup. Now, on the 3rd day, the Duke was walking, and Jacintha turned the corner of the gallery and came down the corridor of the long library wing with her arms full of books. And there he was, standing in the doorway of the library itself, one hand braced on the frame, watching her. She stopped. For a moment neither spoke. The corridor smelled of beeswax and damp stone. A maid was scrubbing the marble at the far end and had her back to them. Rain rattled the high windows. "Miss Bourchier." "Your Grace." He inclined his head, the smallest motion. The saber scar caught the gray light from the window and stood out white against his cheek. "You are carrying a great quantity of Latin. His lordship is conjugating, Your Grace." "I see. May I?" It was not a question. He stepped forward and lifted the top 3 volumes from her arms with the careful slowness of a man who did not trust his own balance, and she felt the brief weight of his hand against hers through the leather. He turned and walked into the library and laid the books on a low table by the fire. She followed because she could not refuse, and because she did not wish to. "Sit," he said. "Your Grace, the boy expects me. The boy is 6 minutes' walk from here, and his nurse is with him. Sit." She sat. She arranged her hands in her lap as she had been taught at 15 by a governess who had taught her nothing else of use. He did not sit at once. He stood with his back to the fire, and the heat through his coat must have been considerable, but he stood there, as if he had decided to feel something other than cold, for the first time in 3 years. "I have not thanked you," he said, "for staying with him through Lady Welburn's illness last spring. I was informed only this morning, by Mrs. Pemberton." She lowered her eyes a fraction. "It was not a service that required thanks, Your Grace. Permit me to be the judge of that." A pause. "He was 4 years old, and his mother was dying, and you sat with him every night for 11 nights, and you did not let him into her room when she began to call out, and you did not lie to him about why. I told him she was very tired. You told him she was going." "Yes." He turned his face slightly toward the fire, and the scar was hidden, and what was left was the angular jaw and the steel-gray eye gone for an instant unguarded. "I could not," he said. "No, Your Grace. I was in the room with her for the last 3 hours, and I could not say it to my own son. He would not have understood it from you, Your Grace. He would have understood that something terrible was being done to him by his father. From me, it was only a sad thing happening in the house." He looked at her then, properly, as if he had not, until that moment, seen her face. "That is a precise distinction, Miss Bourchier. I have had occasion to consider it, Your Grace." He sat at last, not opposite her, which would have been a confrontation, but in the leather wing chair angled 3/4 toward the fire, which placed him at her side and made the conversation a thing they were both watching the flames hold. It was, she understood, the posture of a man who had been a soldier. You did not look an injured animal in the eye. You sat beside it and let it choose. "My wife wrote to me in Spain in the 2nd year of the war," he said. "She wrote that he had begun to walk. I read the letter under a hedgerow outside Talavera the night before they cut my face open. I have kept it, of course. I read it again last spring, after she died. I read it again last week, when I could no longer hold a spoon. Your Grace, I am telling you this, Miss Bourchier, because you have not asked, and because you appear to be the only person in this house who is not at present trying to determine what I am worth dead." The fire snapped. Jacintha did not move. She had perhaps, in the whole of her 23 years, learned only one useful trick of conversation, which was that silence offered to a wounded man was a gift, not a failure of speech. She offered it. He drew breath. The breath went deeper than she expected, and held, and let go. "My son," he said. "Tell me about him," she told him. She told him that Cassian had memorized the first declension in 4 days and the second in 3, and had asked, on the morning he completed the third, whether Latin had been invented by God or by a particular Roman, and that she had said by Romans, and he had said then he hoped to meet one. She told him that Cassian disliked the color green and would not eat peas. She told him that he had nightmares of a great horse without a rider, and that she had taught him to draw the horse on a piece of paper and fold the paper and put it inside a drawer, and that the nightmares had ceased on the 11th night. She told him that his son was small for his age and would not be tall perhaps, but that he was already brave in the particular way of children who have understood, very young, that the world will not bend for them. She did not tell him that Cassian asked, twice a week, when his father would come down. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she stopped, the fire had burned low, and the maid at the end of the corridor had finished her scrubbing and gone, and the rain had thinned to a fine gray hush against the windows. "I shall come to the schoolroom this afternoon," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "At 3. He will be ready." He rose. She rose with him. He looked at her once more, and what he did not say was that he had not, until that morning, been certain he wished to live, and that her account of a boy folding a paper horse into a drawer had decided the matter for him. He did not say it, and she did not require him to say it. She saw it pass behind his eye, and she lowered her gaze before he could read that she had seen. "Miss Bourchier, Your Grace, you will dine with us this evening." She felt the cold of it pass through her at once. "Your Grace, the governess does not dine at. You will dine with us this evening. I have asked Mrs. Pemberton to set a place." "Yes, Your Grace." He left her standing by the fire with her arms empty and the book still on the low table. At 3 o'clock he came to the schoolroom. Jacintha had set Cassian at the long deal table with a slate and a piece of chalk and the third declension open before him. The boy was bent over the slate with his sandy curls fallen across his forehead, the missing front teeth giving his concentration a small comic gravity. He did not hear his father enter. The Duke stopped in the doorway. He stood there for perhaps half a minute and only watched. Then Cassian turned and saw and did not move. His small hand went still on the chalk. The gray eyes that were precisely his father's lifted and held. "Papa, Cassian." The boy did not run to him. He had been taught, by the long absence of his father and the longer absence of his mother, not to run at people. He slid carefully down from the high chair, set the chalk in its tray with exact care, and walked the length of the table, and stopped 1 pace short of the Duke, and bowed from the waist, as he had been taught. The Duke knelt. The action cost him. Jacintha saw the brief whitening at the corner of his mouth as the knee took his weight. He did it anyway. He went down on one knee and put his hand, the long fine soldier's hand with the signet on the smallest finger, on his son's shoulder, and he looked the boy steadily in the face. "I have been ill," he said. "Yes, Papa. I am better." "Yes, Papa. You have done your Latin." "Yes, Papa. Show me." Cassian led him to the table by one finger and put the slate into his hands, and the Duke sat in the small painted chair that had been his own 40 years before, and listened to his son recite, and corrected him twice, and praised him once. Jacintha stood at the window and looked out at the rain that had not stopped, and she did not let her face show what she felt. She had been a governess long enough to know that the moment a servant was visibly moved was the moment she became inconvenient. When he rose to leave, he turned at the door. "At 7, Miss Bourchier." "Yes, Your Grace." He went out. Cassian climbed back onto the high chair and took up his chalk. He did not speak for a long moment. Then, without looking up, he said, "Miss Bourchier, was Papa always like that?" "Like what, my lord?" "Quiet." She came and stood behind him and put one hand lightly on the back of the chair. "I think, my lord, that he is at present only tired. He is better. He is better." The boy considered this with the seriousness he brought to all matters of fact, and then bent again to the slate, and copied out the genitive plural in a careful round hand. Below them, in the small anteroom behind the morning room where she conducted what she called her correspondence, Drusilla Scrope set down her pen. She had been writing to her brother in Bath, and she had begun the letter in good humor, and she was no longer in good humor. The Duke had taken a 4th dose at noon and had walked, unassisted, the length of the long gallery. Cain had been summoned and had stood in the doorway of the morning room with his ruddy hands twisted in front of him, and had said, in a low, strained voice, that he could not account for it. "You cannot account for it. My lady, the dose is correct, the preparation is correct, the preparation, my lady." She had risen from the writing desk and crossed to him in 3 slow steps and stopped 6 inches from his face. The Indian shawl had slipped from one shoulder. She had not lifted it. "Dr. Kane, you will take the cobalt bottle from his bedside this evening, and you will replace it with a fresh bottle prepared by your own hand, in this house, in my presence. Do you understand me? My lady? In my presence." "Yes, my lady." He had bowed and gone, and she had returned to the desk, and she had not finished the letter. She had sat for some minutes looking at the ivory fan on the blotter, and then she had taken up the pen and drawn, very neatly, a small, careful cross beside the name of Miss Bourchier in the household list she kept at the back of her appointment book. She had drawn the cross in red ink. Mrs. Pemberton came to Jacintha at 6. The housekeeper knocked once at the schoolroom door and entered without waiting, and her right hand was shaking more than usual. She closed the door behind her and crossed to the window where Jacintha stood pinning her collar in the dim glass. "He has sent for Kane again." "I know. He has told Kane to prepare a fresh bottle in his presence." In her presence, I should say. Jacintha's hand paused at the pin. "Tonight, after supper, in the still room. Then the cobalt bottle on the bedside is the last one we have touched." "Yes." Jacintha set the pin and turned. The older woman's lively dark eyes had gone very steady, the way they always went when she was frightened and had decided not to be. "Honora, child, if Kane prepares it in her presence, we cannot reach it." "No. And if the Duke drinks it tomorrow, he will be dead by Friday." "Yes." A silence. Below them somewhere a door closed, and a footman's voice carried briefly along the back stair and was gone. "Then Kane," Jacintha said, "must not prepare it." Mrs. Pemberton drew breath. "Child, what are you?" "He has a wife in Matlock and 3 daughters. He has debts at Brooks's that his wife does not know of. The eldest daughter is to be married at Christmas. I have heard him weeping in the back passage on 3 separate occasions this year. He is not a brave man, Honora. He is only a frightened one who has gone too far. You will speak to him." "I will speak to him. Tonight, before supper. In the still room. Before she comes down." The housekeeper looked at her for a long moment, and the half-moon glasses caught the candlelight, and what passed between them did not require speech. Mrs. Pemberton inclined her head once, and turned, and went out. Jacintha finished her collar. Her hands did not shake. Her hands ceased to shake at the moment a situation became impossible. It was the only useful inheritance her father had left her. She went down the back stair. The still room lay at the end of the kitchen passage, a long, narrow chamber smelling of dried lavender and copper. Kane was there alone. He had the leather bag open on the deal table and was laying out his vials in a careful row, and the ruddy hands were not steady, and he had not yet lit the second candle, and he did not hear her come in. "Doctor," he turned with a jerk. The blue eyes that would not meet anyone's went at once to the floor. "Miss Bourchier, close the door." He closed it. "Dr. Kane, you will not prepare that bottle tonight." His head came up. The weak chin trembled. You cannot. You will tell her Grace that the principal ingredient is wanting from your bag, and that you must ride to Derby in the morning. You will tell her you cannot prepare it in this house tonight. You will give her any reason that pleases you, but you will not prepare it. She will dismiss me. She will hang you. When this is finished, doctor, and it will be finished, she will hang you, and she will not hang alone. You know this. You knew it the day you signed the order for the cobalt bottle. You have known it for 3 weeks. I am offering you, tonight, the last hour in which you may still choose." He did not answer. He looked at the row of vials on the deal table, and his pink hand went up to his mouth. "There is a letter," she said more quietly, "in the hand of Mr. Wallop in Lincoln's Inn. It has not yet been written. Whether it is written depends on you. Miss Bourchier, Derby in the morning, doctor. That is all I ask of you tonight. Tomorrow we shall speak of the rest." He drew a long breath that shook in his chest. He nodded once. He did not look at her. She turned and went out and closed the door behind her with the soft, precise click of a woman who had not, in the whole transaction, raised her voice above the level of ordinary conversation. She climbed the back stair with the cobalt vial warm against her ribs and her face composed. That evening Jacintha came down to dine. She wore the same feuille-morte gown she had worn all autumn. She had pinned a fresh white collar. She had washed her face and rebraided the low bun and put on the black cameo brooch her mother had left her, and she had come down the back stair and entered the dining room through the door the upper servants used, and she had stood at the place Mrs. Pemberton had set for her, the third on the Duke's right, between the chaplain and an empty chair, and she had waited. Drusilla had looked up from the head of the table and had smiled the slow, calculated smile that did not reach the eyes. "Miss Bourchier, how charming. You will tell us, I hope, all about my stepson's progress in Latin. Your Grace is kind. I am told," Drusilla said, lifting her glass, "that you have lately become quite indispensable to this house." The Duke at the foot of the table did not look up from the carving of the roast. He spoke very evenly into the bird. "She has, my lady. Quite." The fan paused, a single beat, then resumed. And Jacintha, taking her seat, felt the small, cold weight of the cobalt vial against her ribs, and understood, with the perfect clarity of a woman who had counted her enemies all her life, that she had just been moved, in the calculations of the woman at the head of the table, from inconvenience to threat. The morning after the dinner of the cobalt vial, Jacintha rose before the maids and went down to the nursery by the back stair. She did not light a candle. She knew the turn of every loose board by the sound it had made under her foot for 2.5 years, and she meant to leave no record of her passage. Cassian was asleep on his side, one small fist tucked under his cheek, the other curled around a wooden hussar with a chipped saber. She stood at the foot of the cot and counted his breaths. 12 to the minute, even, pink in the cheeks. She had not come for comfort. She had come for arithmetic. A child who slept 12 breaths to the minute had not been dosed in the night. A child who had not been dosed in the night had bought her one more day. She bent and kissed his forehead with the lightest pressure her mouth could manage, then went to the schoolroom and opened the heraldry volume on the lectern. Behind the loose end paper, the folded rascunho was still there. She had not imagined it. She drew it out, smoothed it once on the slope of the lectern, and read it through a second time, with the cold attention of an accountant. The list of Scrope cousins ran down the left-hand margin in Drusilla's narrow, sloping hand. 6 names. Beside the 5th, in red ink, a small, precise tick. Beneath that tick, 3 words. Aged 19, healthy. Beneath those, in a different pen, a single underlined notation. Welburn entail. Male issue only. Cassian. The line under the boy's name had been drawn twice. Once lightly, once with pressure enough to score the page. Jacintha had known this since the night she touched the page, but knowing a thing in the dark of a corridor was not the same as reading it again in cold autumn light with a sleeping child 2 rooms away. The second reading set the matter in her like an iron pin, the Duke first, the boy after, the cousin in. She refolded the paper along its original creases and slid it back behind the end paper. She did not take it with her. A document that disappeared was a document that confessed. A document that stayed where it had been planted could still be produced when there was a magistrate to produce it for. She closed the volume. She straightened the lectern. She went down to the breakfast room. The Duke was already at the table, gloved against the chill, taking nothing but a cup of black tea and a single piece of dry toast. The vertigo had been 3 days quiet. Color had begun to return under the scar. He looked at her as she entered and inclined his head by perhaps 1/4 of an inch, and she returned the bow with the precise depth a governess owes a duke before breakfast. Drusilla was not yet down. "Miss Bourchier, your Grace, sit, if you will. I shall not detain you long." She sat at the corner of the table he indicated, a chair removed from his right hand, and folded her hands in her lap. She did not reach for the tea. He noticed. "You do not drink with me? I have already breakfasted, your Grace." A precaution. The word landed between them like a coin set deliberately on the cloth. He had not phrased it as a question. She did not phrase her answer as one. "A habit, your Grace." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. He set down his cup. "My son sleeps well." "He does." "He did not, 3 weeks ago." "No, your Grace. You changed something." "I changed the hour of his milk and the weight of his blanket." "And nothing else." "And nothing else that I will speak of at this table." It was the boldest sentence she had spoken to him in 2.5 years. She heard it leave her mouth and did not call it back. He looked at her for the count of 3 breaths, and in the steel-gray eyes she saw something shift, very slightly, from assessment to consideration. "Mrs. Pemberton has asked," he said at last, "whether I should care to take my evening draught in the library rather than the small drawing-room. Mrs. Pemberton is attentive to the comfort of the household. Mrs. Pemberton has not, in my memory, troubled herself over the placement of my evening draught. Perhaps your evening draught has not, in her memory, troubled itself over your placement." He set down the toast. For a moment the only sound in the room was the soft tick of the carriage clock on the mantel, and the small dry rasp of a log settling in the grate. Then he stood, crossed to the sideboard, lifted the silver pot of black tea, and poured a fresh cup with his own hand. He set the cup before her. "Drink with me, Miss Bourchier." She lifted the cup and drank. It was the closest thing to an alliance that a duke and a governess could form across a breakfast table in October of 1817, and they both knew it. Drusilla came in then, in ivory silk, the cashmere shawl drawn close against the morning chill, the ivory fan already moving at her wrist. She paused half a step inside the door, took in the cup before the governess, the toast unfinished at the duke's place, and smiled. "How charming," she said. "A council of war over the marmalade." "A discussion of Lord Cassian's progress with his Latin," the duke replied, without turning. "Miss Bourchier was good enough to indulge me. And what progress has my son made?" "Steady, your grace," Jacintha said, rising. "He has begun the second declension." "The second declension! How thrilling for him!" She moved to her chair at the foot of the table with the unhurried grace of a swan crossing a still pond, and Jacintha curtsied and withdrew. At the door she heard the small chime of china as the Duchess lifted the lid of the silver teapot, looked inside, and set it down again with a sound that was almost, but not quite, a sigh. By the 5th week Jacintha had built her second ledger. The first, in her writing desk, contained the household accounts she was paid to keep, the chandler, the linen draper, the wages of the under-nurse. The second she kept folded inside the lining of her stays, against her ribs, where the cobalt vial had lain 3 weeks before. On it, in her smallest hand, she wrote 3 columns. The first column listed the hours at which Dr. Kane's carriage had been heard on the gravel, always between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, always on a Tuesday and a Friday. The second column listed the rooms in which he and the Duchess had been observed alone together: the still room, the small library, the morning room with the door not quite closed. The third column listed the small parcels that had passed from his leather bag to her gloved hand: a folded paper on the 12th, a stoppered file on the 17th. On the 23rd, a sealed letter with no direction on the outside. Mrs. Pemberton supplied the timings. One of the kitchen maids, a niece of Mrs. Pemberton's by a half-sister in Matlock, supplied the rooms. The under-footman, who had a younger brother in Mr. Wallop's chambers in Lincoln's Inn, had been quietly told that a packet would in due course need carrying. Nothing was written that could be read by a stranger. Each entry in the ledger was a single letter and a number: C4, SR-12, ML23. Jacintha had been taught, by a mother who had survived 3 winters in 2 rented rooms after her father died, that a woman without rank kept her evidence in code, or did not keep it at all. On the Friday of the 5th week, the under-footman was sent to Derby with a basket of preserves for the Duke's old nurse, who had retired there, and a separate small flat packet sewn into the lining of the basket's lid. The packet was addressed, in Mrs. Pemberton's hand, to Mr. Phineas Wallop of Lincoln's Inn. It contained a single sheet on which Jacintha had copied, letter for letter, the 3 words in red ink from the heraldry volume: aged 19, healthy. Beneath it, in Mrs. Pemberton's hand, Dr. Roderick Kane attends her grace twice weekly. Sums have passed. We do not yet know from which account. It was a careful sentence. "We do not yet know" was a phrase that protected them both if the basket were opened. The basket was not opened. The Duke, meanwhile, had begun to walk in the long gallery in the afternoons. Jacintha noticed it on the second day, because the gallery ran past the schoolroom, and the boards above the great chimney creaked under any boot heavier than a child's. He walked from the portrait of the second Duke to the portrait of his own mother, and back again, 4 turns, the same hour each day, the hour at which Drusilla took her dish of bohea in the small drawing-room. He did not climb to the schoolroom. He did not need to. Each time he passed, he paused for perhaps 3 seconds beneath the painting of his mother, and each time Cassian, who had been taught by Jacintha to listen for the pause, looked up from his slate and said, very softly, "Papa is in the gallery." It was the small ceremony of a household that had decided, without speech, where its loyalties lay. On the Saturday of that week, the Duchess sent word that she would receive 3 ladies of the neighborhood at tea on the following Tuesday, and that Miss Bourchier was to bring Lord Cassian down at 4:30 to make his bow. The note arrived on Jacintha's writing desk on a folded sheet of cream paper, sealed with the Welburn crest in red wax, and beneath the instruction, in a postscript written closer to the seal than was strictly elegant: "I trust your room is in good order, Miss Bourchier. I shall send Hannah up to refresh the linen." Jacintha read the postscript twice. Then she crossed the corridor to Mrs. Pemberton's parlor, closed the door behind her, and said, in the level voice of a woman who has spent the last hour pricing her own life, she means to plant something. In my chamber, Tuesday. Mrs. Pemberton did not lift her eyes from the linen she was folding. What would she plant, my dear? Whatever is small enough to be hidden under a Bible and large enough to be a felony. A jewel, then? A jewel. Mrs. Pemberton folded the last napkin, set it on the stack, and looked at her at last. The half-moon spectacles caught the light from the window. Then we shall let her plant it. Jacintha did not speak. My dear, if she plants nothing, she will try the next thing. If she plants a jewel, we shall know which jewel and on what day, and which maid carried it up. And Mr. Wallop, in Lincoln's Inn, shall know also. She will turn me out. She will. In the rain, if she can manage it. She will manage it, she is that sort. And the boy. Mrs. Pemberton set down her spectacles. The boy will not be left here without a friend, Miss Bourchier. I have served the Mowbrays for 41 years. The first thing I learned was where the keys hung. The last thing I shall learn, if it comes to it, is which door is left unbolted at night. Jacintha sat down on the small stool by the fire. She had not realized, until the back of her knees met the wood, how long she had been standing. Honora, she said. It was the first time she had used the housekeeper's Christian name in 2.5 years. My dear, if she puts me out, the vial leaves with me. It must. It is the only thing she cannot replace. It is. They sat for a moment in the small room with the firelight on the brass keyring at Mrs. Pemberton's waist, and outside the window the autumn rain began, very lightly, against the panes. On the Monday, Drusilla took her morning ride with Dr. Kane in attendance, which she had never done before. They were observed by the head groom, who reported to Mrs. Pemberton, who said nothing but made a small mark in the household book beside the date. That same Monday, after his afternoon turn in the gallery, the Duke summoned Jacintha to the library. He did not sit. He stood at the long window with his back to the room, the steel-gray eyes fixed on the avenue of limes turning bronze in the wet light. She waited at the carpet's edge. You will be accused tomorrow, he said. She did not answer at once. She had not expected him to know. She had hoped, very privately, that he might. By whom, Your Grace? By my wife, in the presence of 3 women who will repeat what they have heard before sunset. And the charge, theft, possibly more. He did not turn. The signet ring on his right pinky caught the light as he set one gloved hand against the frame. I cannot prevent it, he said. If I intervene before witnesses, I confirm the second charge and ruin the first, you understand. I do, Your Grace. You will not be friendless. There is a man in Lincoln's Inn whose name you know. I know it. Go to him. It was, she understood, both an order and the closest thing to a promise a Duke of Welborn could offer a woman he had taken tea with, once, on a cold October morning. She curtsied and withdrew. On the Monday evening, the under-housemaid Hannah was sent up to refresh the linen in Miss Bourchier's chamber, although the linen had been refreshed 2 days before. On the Tuesday morning, Jacintha rose early, opened the chest beneath her bed in which she kept her 2 spare gowns, her mother's prayer book, and the small carved box of her father's letters, and went through the box letter by letter. She found nothing that had not been there before. She closed the chest. She did not look under the Bible on her nightstand. If something had been placed there, it would still be there in the afternoon, and she did not wish, when the moment came, to be a woman who had known in the morning what she was meant to discover in front of witnesses. At 4:30, she dressed Cassian in his cream waistcoat and his navy skeleton suit, smoothed the loose curls back from his forehead, and led him down the great stair by the hand. She wore the feuille morte gown, the pale gray apron, the black cameo at her throat. She had pinned the white linen cap 1/4 of an inch higher than usual, so that the small line of dark hair at her brow showed. It was a vanity she allowed herself, on the day she was to be ruined. In the small drawing room, the 3 ladies of the neighborhood were already seated. A thin clergyman's widow with disapproving eyes, the wife of a Derby magistrate, and a dowager countess who was a cousin of Drusilla's mother. The Duchess sat at the center with the silver tea equipage before her, the ivory fan closed across her lap, the smile already arranged. Lord Cassian, she said, come and make your bow to your mamma's friends. Cassian made his bow with the small, precise gravity of a child who had been rehearsed. And Miss Bourchier, how good of you to bring him down. Drusilla's eyes moved, for the briefest instant, to the small table at the window, on which her own reticule had been placed, open, the silk lining slightly disturbed. Then she looked back. with the slow, calculated smile that did not reach her eyes. "Will you take tea with us, Miss Bourchier? I find I have a small matter to raise, and I should prefer that it be raised in company." The clergyman's widow set down her cup. The magistrate's wife folded her hands. The dowager countess, who had not yet been told her part, leaned very slightly forward. Jacintha curtsied, the precise depth a governess owes a duchess in her own drawing-room, and crossed to the chair the duchess indicated, and the trap, which had been a month in the building, closed its first quiet jaw around her heel. The drawing-room was warm with too many candles. 3 widows of the county had been arranged on the rose-colored sofas like figures on a confectioner's mantle, their bonnets nodding in unison, as the Duchess of Welborn poured the bohea with her own white hand. Lady Drusilla wore her ivory Gros de Naples and her pearls, and the slow smile that never reached her ice-blue eyes. Jacintha sat upright on the edge of a small bergère, the chair to which she had been pointed, her brown sleeves folded against the apron, the cameo cold at her throat. She had been called down from the schoolroom mid-lesson, Cassian's slate still chalked in her hand, and she had set it on the hall table as Mrs. Pemberton passed and pressed her elbow once, in warning. "Miss Bourchier teaches my son his Latin," Drusilla said, "and rather more besides." She lifted the silver tongs. "Sugar, Lady Marchmont?" The widow Marchmont accepted 2 lumps. The clock on the mantel struck the half. Jacintha counted the strokes and waited for the blade. It came in the shape of a pearl. "How clumsy of me," Drusilla murmured. The string at her throat had parted, and 4 pearls rolled across the carpet toward the bergère. "Miss Bourchier, would you? The light is so poor." Jacintha knelt. She found 3 pearls within her reach. The 4th had rolled, by a small miracle of geometry, beneath the hem of her own brown gown. "Allow me," said Lady Marchmont, and bent before Jacintha could rise. The widow's gloved fingers retrieved the pearl, and with it, a small flat thing that caught the candlelight and threw back the color of midnight water. A sapphire, set in old gold, the size of a sparrow's eye. Lady Marchmont held it up between 2 fingers. "My dear Duchess, whatever is this?" Drusilla rose slowly, a hand at her parted pearls, and her face composed itself into the precise expression of a woman who has not expected a discovery and is too well bred to enjoy it. "I had thought," she said softly, "that I had lost that brooch a fortnight ago, from my own dressing table." The 3 bonnets turned together. Jacintha did not move from her knees. She understood, before any word was spoken, that the room had already decided. "There must be some mistake," she said. "There is always a mistake," Drusilla answered, "when a servant is caught with her mistress's jewels in her skirts." She crossed to the bell-pull and rang it twice. "Mrs. Pemberton, send for his grace." Jacintha rose. The pearl in her hand was still warm. The Duke came in his riding coat, mud on his boots, the scar at his jaw white from cold. He stopped just inside the door and read the room in a single sweep. The widows, the wife, the sapphire on the widow's open palm, the governess standing alone by the bergère, Drusilla, Orlando. Her voice carried the smallest tremor, perfectly placed. "I am most grieved. The brooch I told you was lost. It was in Miss Bourchier's hem." The gray eyes moved to Jacintha. For one heartbeat she saw, plainly, that he did not believe it. The next heartbeat hid that knowing behind a discipline older than the scar. "Miss Bourchier, your grace, the brooch was placed there. I do not know by whom." "I do know by whom." "There is more," Drusilla said gently. She drew a folded paper from her sleeve and laid it on the tea-table between the cups. "This was found beneath her pillow, by the chambermaid. This morning, the Duke did not touch it." Lady Marchmont, who had clearly been instructed when to be useful and when curious, leaned and unfolded the page herself and made a soft sound that was not entirely shock. It was a love letter, or what would pass for one, in a court of family law. 5 lines, in a careful hand, addressed to "My dearest O." It spoke of stolen hours in the library and of a child not yet announced. It was signed, in the same careful hand, with the initial J. Jacintha, read it upside down across the table, and understood, with cold clarity, that the hand was a fair copy of her own. Drusilla had been at the schoolroom registers. "That is not my hand," she said. "It is your hand," Drusilla replied, "to any man who has not studied it." She lifted her eyes to the Duke with the courage of a woman protecting a husband from his own folly. "Orlando, I would have spared you, but the widows are witness. The matter cannot now be private." The widow Carrington, who had not yet spoken, pressed a handkerchief to her dry lips. It is the brooch that decides it, of course, she said. A letter, one might forgive. Theft, one cannot. The Duke crossed to the table. He did not look at the letter. He looked at the sapphire. He turned it once in the light, and the muscle at his jaw moved. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, had come in behind him and stood with her keyring silent against her skirts. Your Grace, has Miss Bourchier had occasion to be in her Grace's dressing room? Never, Your Grace. You will swear to that. Upon the book, Your Grace. Drusilla's smile did not waver. Mrs. Pemberton has been 40 years in this house. She has loved my husband since he wore short coats. Her word, in this matter, is naturally that of a mother. It was a precise, elegant lie, and it cut Mrs. Pemberton off the witness stand without a blow. Your Grace, Jacintha said. Her voice was level, because she could not afford it to be anything else. I ask leave to speak. Speak. The brooch was placed in my hem in this room, within the last quarter of an hour. The letter is not in my hand. I will write any line you choose, here, on this table, and you will see the difference at the bottoms of the G and the Y. My dear, Drusilla said, any governess can disguise her hand under examination. Then let the examination be by your own solicitor, Jacintha said. Let Mr. Wallop be sent for, tonight. The name moved through the room like a draught under a door. Lady Marchmont glanced at the Duchess. The Duchess did not glance back. Mr. Wallop, Drusilla said lightly, is in London on business of the estate. We shall not trouble him with a servant's misconduct. Then send for the magistrate. And expose this house to the broadside sheets? Orlando, surely not. The Duke had been silent through the exchange. He set the sapphire on the table beside the letter. He spoke without raising his voice, which was the voice that had once held a square at Talavera, while Grapeshot took the line. Miss Bourchier, you will go to your room, you will pack a single trunk, you will be off these grounds within the hour. The widows lowered their eyes in the satisfied way of women who have witnessed a decency. Jacintha did not move. Your Grace, the boy. You will not see the boy. Your Grace, you will not see the boy. It was said the second time without any color at all, which is how a man speaks when he is holding a thing closed with both hands. She curtsied. The depth was that of a governess to a duke, neither more nor less. She passed Drusilla without looking at her. At the door she paused. Your Grace, she said over her shoulder, to the Duke, you will find that the cobalt bottle in the medicine cabinet is not what it was. I would wish you to remember that, when you next take your draught. The room did not understand the sentence. Only one person in it did. Drusilla's white hand went, for the briefest instant, to the line of her own throat. Jacintha went out. In the schoolroom she did not pack. She lifted Cassian from his stool, where he had drawn a horse with 5 legs across his slate, and she held him against her shoulder and breathed the warm milk and soap smell of the back of his neck. He was small for his age, and his arms went round her without question. Are you going away, Miss Bourchier? For a little while. How long? As long as it takes to come back. Promise. She did not promise. She had taught him already not to ask for promises that depended upon other people's mothers. You will say your Latin every morning. Amo, amas, amat. You will not eat the sweets your stepmother brings to the nursery. Do you hear me, Cassian? Not even one. You will give them to the dogs. He nodded against her collar. You will tell Mrs. Pemberton if you are tired, or cold, or if your father's hand shakes at the table. You will tell her, and only her. Yes, Miss Bourchier. She set him down. She took the small brass key of his nursery cabinet from her chatelaine and pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers over it. Then she crossed to the paneled wall behind the globe, where a loose pilaster hid a cavity the size of a hand. From the cavity she drew a small object, swathed in linen, and tucked it into the front of her bodice, between the cameo and the warmth of her skin. The cobalt bottle, marked at its waist with a small cross of brown wax. The X bottle, the proof. She had had the wit to move it from her bedchamber an hour after Drusilla first spoke kindly to her at breakfast. A woman who plants jewels will plant other things. She kissed Cassian's hair once, at the parting. She went down the back stairs. Mrs. Pemberton was waiting at the kitchen door with a gray wool cloak, a sealed paper, and a purse that chinked with the soft sound of a housekeeper's life savings. To Lincoln's Inn, child, to Wallop himself. He answers no clerk on a matter such as this. The paper is from me. He will know the hand. They will say you are dismissed by morning. Then I shall be dismissed by morning. The old woman's hand trembled on the keyring, but her mouth did not. Take the lane behind the orchard. The lodge-keeper has gone to the alehouse and will not see you. There is no horse for you, child. There is no carriage. There is only your 2 feet and God's mercy. It is 11 miles to the village. Then walk 11 miles. The rain began before she reached the orchard wall. It came down in the slow, heavy autumn way that does not stop. By the lane behind the kennels, her slippers were already soaked through. She did not look back at the lit windows of the great house. She had taught herself, long ago, not to look back at warmth she could not return to. At the 3rd milestone, the lamp at the gate lodge dimmed behind her and went out. After that there was only the dark and the white road and the cold knock of the cobalt bottle against her breastbone with every step. At the 5th milestone she stopped because she had to. She knelt at the verge and pressed her forehead against the wet stone and allowed herself, for the length of one breath, to make a sound. It was a small sound and no one heard it. Then she stood up and went on. She thought, as she walked, of the boy's 2 missing front teeth. She thought of the way the Duke had said, "You will not see the boy," and had not been able to look at her on the second saying. She thought of the rolled paper she carried, and of Mr. Wallop's mutton chops, which she had glimpsed once at Michaelmas, and of the careful hand that had forged her own. By the 7th milestone the rain had become sleet. By the 9th her teeth were knocking. At the 10th a farm cart passed her and did not stop, because a woman alone on the road at that hour, in soaked brown wool, was not a creature a sensible man acknowledged. At 11 miles she came to the lit window of the 3 Crowns at Welburn village. She stood across the road in the dark and counted the coins in Mrs. Pemberton's purse by feel. There were enough for the night coach to Derby and the morning mail to London. There were not enough, she calculated, for an hour's mistake. She crossed the road. The bell over the inn door rang. The landlord looked up from his ledger and took in the soaked governess in his doorway, and the cameo at her throat, and the way her hand stayed pressed to the front of her bodice, as if she were holding her own heart inside her ribs. "Miss," he said carefully, "we do not at this hour." "The London coach," she said. "What time does it pass?" "4:15, miss, from the yard." She set a coin on the counter. "A seat, inside, and a fire until then. I will sit in the corner. I will give no one any trouble." He looked at the coin. He looked at her face. He had been a sergeant in the Duke's old regiment, 20 years before, and he had seen women walk in out of rain before, and he had learned that some of them were carrying things heavier than they appeared. "Sit by the fire, miss. The fire is on the house." She sat. She did not let her hand leave her bodice. Outside, the sleet thickened to snow. Inside, the clock above the bar ticked toward the 4:15 with the slowness of a thing that did not yet know it had become the hinge of a house. The taproom held 3 men at that hour. A drover asleep with his cheek on the boards, a curate reading a tract too small for his eyes, and a thin gray commercial traveler who looked up from his ledger when she sat down, looked at her face once, and looked away again, with the small private decency of a man who knew when not to ask. She drank the cup of broth the landlord set before her without remembering that she had not eaten since breakfast. She thought of Cassian alone in the schoolroom with the brass key warm in his fist. She thought of Mrs. Pemberton standing in the kitchen door watching her cross the orchard. She thought of the Duke's voice the second time, and she allowed herself the cold thought that he had not been a fool and would not remain one long. She drew Mrs. Pemberton's sealed letter from beneath the cloak and turned it twice in her hand without breaking it. The seal was the old housekeeper's own, a sprig of yew pressed in red wax, a small jest the woman had kept since girlhood. Yew, the very tree from which the poison had been drawn. Honora Pemberton had been clearer in her warnings than Jacintha had understood at the time. At 3:15, a horse came into the yard at a hard gallop. Jacintha rose halfway from the settle before she understood the rider was not in Welborn livery. It was a postboy from the next village, with a satchel of papers for the down mail. She sat back. Her hand was shaking now, and she could not, by any discipline, persuade it to be still. The landlord brought a second cup of broth and a heel of bread without being asked, and set them at her elbow, and went away. At Welburn Hall, Lady Drusilla had crossed from the bell back to the window and stood looking out at the snow. The candle behind her threw her shadow long across the carpet. She did not call her maid. She did not call her husband. She stood thinking, with the cold patience of a creature that has been planning a thing for 11 months and has just discovered, in the space of a quarter hour, that a small gray woman in a brown gown had been planning against her for 9. Somewhere on the back stairs, Mrs. Pemberton was carrying a tray of warm milk to the schoolroom and finding the boy already asleep across his slate, his fist still curled around a brass key. In the inn yard, the ostler led out the mail coach team and put on the bells. The landlord touched Jacintha's elbow. "Miss, they're harnessing." She rose. She drew the cloak about her, the cobalt bottle pressed against the cameo at her breastbone with the small, steady weight of a thing that had not yet been spent. At Welbourn Hall, in the same hour, Lady Drusilla Scrope stood alone at her dressing table and unpinned her ostrich feather with steady fingers. She set the pearls back upon their velvet. She lifted the cobalt bottle from the medicine cabinet, weighed it once in her hand, and uncorked it. She raised it to the candle. The liquid within was the pale, sweet, harmless gold of chamomile water. For a long moment, the Duchess of Welbourn did not move. The candle flame made a small twin in each of her ice-blue eyes. Then she set the bottle down very carefully on the marble, as one sets down a thing one does not yet know how to break, and she crossed slowly to the bell, and she did not ring it. In the dark beyond her window, 11 miles south, the London mail coach harnessed its team in a snow-bright inn yard, and a young woman in a soaked brown gown rose from a settle by a fire and stepped out into the cold to climb aboard. The mail coach rolled south through a gray dawn, and Jacintha did not sleep. She sat by the window with the cloak drawn close, the cobalt bottle warm against her ribs, and watched the hedgerows of Northamptonshire flatten into the long brown fields of the shires. A farmer raised his hat to the coach. A boy ran a dog through stubble. Somewhere a church bell rang for early service. She counted the bells because counting kept her from thinking of Cassian's bed. At Barnet she changed coaches. At Highgate she saw the first chimneys of London smoking against a pewter sky. By the time the wheels struck the cobbles of Holborn, the bells were striking 11, and she had not eaten since the inn. She paid the guard from the last of Mrs. Pemberton's coins and stepped down into a city that smelt of coal, horses, and wet stone. Lincoln's Inn lay behind its iron gate like a town within the town. She crossed New Square. A porter raised a brow at her muddy hem and let her pass. The board on the staircase read, "Wallop and Sons, first floor." She climbed. A clerk looked up. Pen poised. "Madam, Mr. Phineas Wallop. I am Jacintha Bourchier. I serve the Duke of Welbourn's house." The pen lowered. The inner door opened a half-minute later. Mr. Wallop stood in his old-cut black frock coat, his round spectacles low on the aquiline nose, his long mutton chops still touched with breakfast crumbs. He looked at her hem, at her face, at the cameo at her throat. He stepped aside. "Come in, Miss Bourchier. Shut the door, Pemberton's nephew, and admit no one." The room smelt of vellum and old wax. A coal fire muttered. Wallop did not sit. He gestured to a chair and watched her take it, and she saw at once that he had been expecting her, or expecting something, for longer than this morning. She laid the cobalt bottle on the blotter. She laid beside it the folded sheet of heraldry torn from the Welbourn library. She laid beside that the housekeeper's letter, sealed with a thumbprint in candle wax. Wallop sat. He drew the lamp closer. He took up the bottle first and tilted it against the light, and the cross of dark wax winked on the glass. He set it down with great care, as a man sets down a loaded pistol. "You!" he said. "Yes, you will permit me." He drew on a pair of cotton gloves from his drawer and opened the letter. He read. His thin mouth tightened. He read again. He took the heraldry sheet, smoothed it on the blotter, and bent his spectacles over the inked margin where a 19-year-old Scrope nephew had been ringed in red. He laid the sheet down and looked at her over the rims. "Miss Bourchier. Did her Grace write this hand?" "It is hers. I have her household lists in my box at Welbourn. The loop on the capital S is the same. And the boy? He sleeps 2 doors from me. He sleeps without me now." Wallop stood. He crossed to a deed press in the corner and unlocked it with a key from his watch chain. He drew out a slim morocco folder and brought it to the desk. He did not open it at once. "I served the late Duchess," he said. "I drew her marriage settlements. I drew the trust for the heir. When His Grace remarried, I was not consulted. That, in itself, was a curiosity to me." He opened the folder. Inside lay 3 letters, ribboned together. "Dr. Kane," he said, "has been in debt to a Mr. Scrope of Lincoln's Inn Fields for £1,100 since the spring. Mr. Scrope is a cousin of Her Grace. The debt was extended in May. It was forgiven on the day His Grace's first illness was recorded in the parish." She did not speak. "You did right," he said quietly, "to come to me and not to a magistrate. A magistrate would have taken the bottle, called for Bow Street, and lost the room. We will not lose the room." He rang a bell. The clerk appeared. "Send for Dr. Ainsworth of the Royal College. Send to Bath for the records of His Grace's first marriage, the physician's certificate of Her Grace Maria's confinement. Send a discreet word to Mr. Hatchett at Mayfair, and bring me the court circular." The clerk vanished. Wallop turned back to her. "There is to be a ball at Welburn House, the 30th. She is to announce, I believe, an interesting condition." "Yes, she is not capable of one." Jacintha lifted her eyes. "How do you know?" "Because the late Lord Scrope, her father, came to me 20 years ago in a different matter. The Scrope physician in Bath wrote a certificate at her 16th year. There was a fever. There were consequences. The certificate exists. It has existed in a vault in Chancery Lane these 12 years. She set her hands flat on the chair arms to keep them still. "Then she planned this," she said, "from the day she married him. From before, I should think." Wallop took off his spectacles and polished them on his cravat. "Miss Bourchier, you will lodge tonight at my sister's house in Bedford Row. You will not be seen in the street. You will eat, you will sleep. Tomorrow we will draft the affidavit. By Thursday, Dr. Ainsworth will have tested the contents of this bottle. By Saturday, Bath will have answered. The ball is on the 30th. We shall be ready." She did not move. "Mr. Wallop, the boy." "The boy is the point of the whole exercise, Miss Bourchier. We do not lose him." She bent her head. She did not cry. She had not cried since the rain on the avenue, and she would not begin now in a solicitor's chamber. She breathed once, in, out, and stood. "Then let us be ready by the 30th. The days narrowed to work. Dr. Ainsworth came in a closed carriage with a leather case and took the bottle away in cotton wadding. He returned on Thursday with a paper signed and sealed. Taxine, in lethal concentration, dissolved in distilled water, with a trace of clove for flavor. The Bath records arrived on Friday in a locked tin, a certificate in a copperplate hand, signed and witnessed, naming Drusilla Scrope, 16, as a woman henceforth incapable of issue. Cain's debts to the Scrope cousin came in a clerk's ledger on Saturday morning, copied out in 3 columns. On Sunday, Wallop went himself to call upon Dr. Cain in his lodgings off Wimpole Street. He returned at 2 with a confession in Cain's own slanting hand, signed in the presence of a curate and a deputy of the Royal College. Wallop laid it on the desk and did not look pleased, as another man might have looked pleased. He looked only tired. He wept, he said. He drank a great deal and he wept. He said she promised him a country practice in Wiltshire. And the Duke? His Grace has been 4 days without his draught. The Welburn physician writes that the dizziness is gone. She closed her eyes. She opened them. "Does he know I am here?" "He knows you are not in any river or any hedge. I had that conveyed." "By whom?" "Mrs. Pemberton found a way." Wallop almost smiled. "Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Bourchier, has been finding ways for 40 years. On the morning of the 30th, a footman delivered a parcel to Bedford Row. It contained no card. The wrapping was plain brown paper. Within lay a gown of jonquil yellow silk, simple in cut, high-waisted, the sleeves short, and the bodice without ornament. A pair of long white kid gloves. A pair of pale satin slippers in her own size. Folded into the bodice, in tissue, lay her mother's cameo, the small black mourning brooch that had been in the box left at Welbourne. There was a single line in a hand she had not seen in 11 days. Steel gray, slanting, plain. "You will be received at the door." O.M. She held the cameo a long while. Then she pinned it at her throat, where it had always belonged. The ball at Welburn House began at 9. By 10, the great staircase was packed with cashmere and feathers, and the candles in the chandelier threw their light onto a sea of jewels. In the center of the long ballroom, Drusilla received her guests under the Mowbray tiara, the cherry-red silk of her gown falling in heavy folds, her hand resting on her stomach with the slow, calculated smile of a woman about to give the world its news. She did not see Wallop. He had come in by the side door an hour before, with 2 clerks, a deputy of the Lord Chancellor's office, and Dr. Ainsworth. They stood in the small antechamber where the supper was laid, and they waited. At 11:15, the major domo struck the floor with his staff for silence. Drusilla drew breath. The double doors at the head of the room opened. Jacintha entered alone. She wore the jonquil silk, the cameo at her throat, no jewels. Her dark hair was drawn into the same low, simple bun, parted in the middle, as it had been in the nursery. She did not look at the crowd. She walked the length of the ballroom on the polished marble, and the orchestra forgot the next bar, and a duchess by the fireplace lifted her fan to her mouth. Drusilla's smile did not move. The hand on the stomach did not move. Behind Jacinta came Wallop, in his old black coat. Behind Wallop came Dr. Ainsworth with a small mahogany tray. Behind Ainsworth came the Lord Chancellor's deputy, with a leather portfolio. The Duke stood at the foot of the dais. He had not moved since the doors opened. His face under the saber scar was the face of a man who had at last understood a thing he had been refusing to understand for a year. He looked at Jacinta. He did not speak. He stepped aside. Wallop reached the center table where the wine was set. He gestured. Ainsworth laid the mahogany tray upon the cloth. One by one the items were placed in the circle of candlelight, and the room came forward to see. The cobalt bottle with the cross of dark wax. The torn sheet of heraldry with the Scrope nephew ringed in red. The Bath certificate of incapacity, 12 years old, in copper plate. Dr. Kane's confession, signed and sealed by the curate's hand. The Wimpole ledger of debts forgiven. Wallop did not raise his voice. He had not needed to raise his voice in 40 years of practice. "Your Grace," he said, addressing the Duke, "I am instructed by Miss Bourchier and by the Crown to lay before this company evidence of attempted murder of the person of the Duke of Wellborn, of conspiracy to take the life of the infant Marquis of Cassington, and of fraudulent representation of pregnancy in furtherance of an unlawful succession by collateral inheritance." The fan by the fireplace fell on the marble. Drusilla's smile at last moved. It did not become anger. It became, for one instant, a face that nobody in the room had ever seen, the face of the girl in Bath at 16, looking at a certificate she could not tear up. Then the calculated smile returned. "This is a governess's slander," she said. Her voice was clear and almost light. "My Lord Duke, will you allow it?" The Duke looked at her. He looked at the bottle. He looked at Jacinta. "I will allow," he said. "The law." The deputy stepped forward. The warrant was read. The Mowbray tiara was lifted from her hair by a footman, who held it as though it might bite him, and laid it on a velvet cushion. Drusilla did not struggle. She walked the length of the ballroom on the same polished marble, between two officers of the Crown, and the orchestra did not play, and the Duchess by the fireplace did not lift her fan. At the door she turned once. She looked at Jacinta. She did not speak. Then she was gone. Dr. Kane's license was revoked at the college the following Tuesday. The Scrope cousins, named in the ledger, were called before a committee of the Lords on charges of conspiracy to defraud the succession. By Michaelmas, their estates were under sequestration, and their name was no longer received in any drawing room east of the park. The marriage to Wellborn was annulled by special petition on the ground of fraudulent contraction, the Bath certificate read into the record. Drusilla was conveyed to a county where her trial would be heard in the spring, and where she would not be seen again by anyone who had stood under the Mowbray chandelier. The ballroom emptied slowly. The candles guttered. Footmen drew the curtains and carried away the trays. At last only Jacinta remained, by the long table where the cobalt bottle had been, and the Duke at the foot of the empty dais. He crossed the marble. He stopped a pace from her. He did not touch her. "Miss Bourchier, Your Grace, my son is upstairs. He has been crying in his sleep for 11 nights. He has asked for you in every one of them." He paused. His voice did not break, but it took effort that it did not. "I have already given Mr. Wallop instruction to draw papers of guardianship in your name, jointly with mine, irrevocable in the boy's lifetime. Whatever else may pass between us, that is done." She felt the room tilt. She steadied on the edge of the table. "Your Grace, I did nothing for the guardianship. You did everything for the guardianship." She bent her head. He waited until she lifted it again. "There is a thing," he said, "I should have said in the library in October and did not. There is a thing I should have said in the avenue when you walked down it and could not. I will say it now in an empty room, because you have earned every room I own, and because I am not a man who learns a lesson twice." She did not breathe. "You were the only one," he said, "who ever truly saw me." The candles burned. The marble was cold under her slippers. She did not move, and he did not move, and after a long moment he bowed, a small bow, of the kind men make to women who have done a great thing, and turned, and left her alone with the empty table. It was 3 weeks later, at Wellborn in Derbyshire, in the first thin sun of December, that he asked her in the rose garden. The roses had been cut back for winter. Cassian was running on the gravel with a wooden sword. The Duke spoke quietly, without ornament, as he spoke of everything that mattered to him. He held a single white rose in his gloved hand. cut that morning from the last bush in the south wall. He did not offer it as men in plays offer roses. He held it as a man holds an argument he has prepared in private and means to make once. "I have been thinking," he said, "of the night I came down the corridor, and you were carrying a basket of mended stockings, and I asked you what you read to my son. I did not know then that I was beginning a conversation that would not end. I know it now." He turned the rose between his fingers. "I am not a young man, and I am not an easy one. The scar will not fade. The melancholy will return in November, as it returns every November. I cannot promise you a lighthouse. I can promise you a true one. I can promise you that Cassian will grow up under a roof where his mother is not a transaction. I can promise you that whatever name you carry henceforth, you will carry it because you chose it, and not because any room in England required it of you." He laid the rose in her hand. "Marry me, Jacintha." She said yes before he had quite finished. They were married in the village church at Candlemas. Mrs. Pemberton stood beside her in a new black bombazine gown and wept without apology. Mr. Wallop signed as witness. Cassian carried the ring on a cushion and dropped it once and picked it up and did not cry. In the long gallery at Welbourne, the portrait of the new Duchess hangs at the end opposite her husband's. She is painted in the jonquil yellow silk. Her hair is parted in the middle and drawn into a low, simple bun. At her throat is the small black cameo of her mother. She is not smiling exactly. She is looking at the painter as a woman looks at a world that has at last consented to see her back. And in the end, that was the only inheritance worth keeping, to be truly seen. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been the quiet person in a grand room, the one nobody bothered to truly see, while you alone noticed what was being done in the dark? Was there a moment when guarding a fragile child mattered more than your own safety, your own name, your own reputation? And do you believe that a small cobalt vial of truth, kept close to the heart, is stronger than every diamond a liar can wear? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and true love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.